Hi, my name's Donna Sgro. I'm based in the Fashion and Textile program at the University of Technology, Sydney. This presentation was made in the coastal area of Coogee, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal and Bidjigal people, whose land has never been ceded. I'd like to pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. So I'll just share my screen now and start my presentation. 1 second. Okay, so my research is in the area of creative pattern cutting for fashion design. In this presentation, I'm going to be discussing a new research inquiry led by my practice as I work on a new project. This project is a collaboration in which I'm the costume designer for a new dance production. Brightness will be the third solo choreographic work by dancer and choreographer Christina Chan. This is the first time I'm designing costumes for a dance performance and the first time working with Christina. So Brightness began its creative development in October 2018 with choreographic exploration by Christina and 3 dancers. I attended for 2 days and brought some of my existing garments, which the dancers explored interacting with. This led to further development as part of a choreographic research residency at Critical Path in Sydney with Christina Chan and visual artist Claire Britton. The research residency took place over 2 weeks in June and August 2019. During this time, I developed 5 new experimental costumes using my method of dynamic cutting. These costumes, titled Morphic 1 through 5, I refer initially to chrysalises to convey the conceptual development underpinning the work. There were several questions which guided the research residency. The questions most appropriate for my research are: how can the method of dynamic cutting evolve in response to the moving body? And how can the choreography evolve in response to the garments? I'd like to first give some background to the development of my dynamic cutting method. This method serves as a springboard in my current research inquiry. I completed my PhD research in creative pattern cutting in 2018 at RMIT. My aim was to develop a creative method for cutting garments. This involved a critique of traditional flat pattern cutting methods I'd used in my fashion design practice. Such techniques typically rely on a standard representation of the female body and garment styles based on block patterns. In my doctoral research, I investigated a way to cut the surface and form of the garment simultaneously by cutting the fabric directly. Dynamic cutting, developed by attuning to material and spatial creativity, developed through my experience with cutting garments. Many fashion designers start with sketches, draping, or adapting an existing garment or pattern. I start designing by cutting and constructing textiles. I anticipated that by extending my method of dynamic cutting, I could further experiment with materials, color and transparency, scale, and the moving body. The notion of interiority emerged as a way to think about garment making and how a garment could interact with the body. Dynamic cutting involves me cutting fabric into smaller pieces, which I then stitch back together. This allows me to shape both the surface and volume of the developing textile. As I cut and stitch, I respond to the developing work to create the final outcome. In my PhD, I undertook a study of butterfly metamorphosis and applied this metaphorically to expand creativity in cutting. During this study, I closely observed and documented the metamorphosis of the butterfly. I became particularly focused on the transitions of the chrysalis. I reflected on the notion of a fluid and evolving body as I observed the changes in the organism. During the emergence of the chrysalis, the surface and body of the organism shifts and morphs. This observation I used to develop my cutting method. My choice of the word chrysalis drives a conceptual working method. It is a productive metaphor which activates my imagination as I cut and construct. I describe the Morphic costumes as spatial textiles because both the surface and interiority of the garment are design variables when cutting and making. By being explicitly aware of these variables during the making process, I cut and form the fabric in novel ways. So Loie Fuller says that nature is our greatest teacher and that no two things are of the same nature or exactly the same. This view of nature, which emphasizes multiplicity in our understanding of form, correlates to the dynamical understanding of form that Goethe theorized. Goethe understood that form is a process in time and a living organism that is in a constant state of coming into being. This sense of becoming underpins how I understood my observations of the chrysalis and how I aim to translate this through my cutting method. The work pioneered by Fuller contextualizes the agency of materials in choreographic terms. This lineage relates the approach to costuming that is emerging in the work I will describe. The natural world figures largely in Christina's work. The current work explores issues of climate change and transformation in natural environments. Within this collaborative project, there are conceptual overlaps which emphasize change and transition in environments, in growth, and in bodies. Chris was interested to integrate textiles into her new work, and this collaboration represents an opportunity to explore how this might be actualized. The costumes I'll outline represent ideas and experiments as I explore my questions about dynamic cutting and the moving body. So I'll introduce and describe the 5 costumes I've produced in this collaboration and outline how they differ from each other. I'll then discuss the findings from this research as I've observed Chris moving in them and conversed with her about her experience and more general aims for brightness. In creating these 5 costumes, I aim to produce a range of options which Chris could explore together with the choreographic development. Hence, I work with differences in scale, fabrication, patterning, and cutting, which aim to provide opportunities for exploration and interaction with the body. The Morphic costumes are not necessarily finished pieces. They can be further cut and developed. Each of the costumes has an interior volume which can be explored by the dancer. This interiority was developed in different ways within each costume by responding to the properties of the fabric. In some, the internal space is close in size to the body. In others, the space is large enough for multiple bodies to be inside at once, or for a single body to interact with the excess volume and fabrication. During the residency, Chris was the sole dancer. However, she plans to choreograph a work that could include up to 3 dancers. The residency was an opportunity for Chris to explore how she could interact with the costumes, and the interactions were recorded using video and photography. The first 3 costumes I created ahead of the residency, so I could assess how Chris responded to them, and I could use this insight to create further works during the time. So the first work, Morphic 1, I would describe as most closely resembling a chrysalis. The costume is the smallest in terms of fabric and volume and has 1 opening. I started by exploring how I could use colour and cutting in combination. I developed juxtapositions of colour by constructing patterns using striped seam work. These I developed as coloured textile surfaces, which I spliced together with others through their seamed construction. The combination of colour and stripe together for me expresses possibilities for dynamic interaction. The constructed work aims to promote the movement of eye across the surface. Each colour creates a visual vibration when placed next to others. As I made this costume, I responded to how the constructed work looked and performed. Overall, I aimed to create an interior space using the textile that the body could fit and move within. In the process of making, I constructed angles and peaks, which I anticipated the body could interact with by extending limbs and changing positions. As I created this costume, I would often put it on my own body and feel and explore the interiority and use this to guide the result as well. As Chris experimented with this costume, it was evident that it produced a range of variables. She sometimes explored its physical extension and alternatively its collapse. Another mode of exploration involved bunching and twisting the fabric to create novel forms. Chris crawled inside and moved while lying on the ground and other times sitting. She sometimes made her body bigger and smaller, interacting with the volume in different ways. Overall, the result was an ambiguous embodiment, sometimes approaching animal. The costume looks different depending upon how it is worn on the body. Colours and patterning changes with rotation. When worn, there are minimal opportunities to view the dancer's body or for the dancer to extend limbs outside of the costume. Chris also could not see herself performing. The qualities of this costume led the next experiment with making. I aim to create a larger internal volume while providing more openings for the body. So Morphic 2, I continue to work with juxtaposing stripes and colour using a different palette. The costume has a large opening at the base and a few additional openings which allow the head, arms and legs to extend through. Following Chris's exploration of the costume, she suggested including smaller holes so that portions of her body, such as a bent elbow or fingers, could extend out. I created a further number of holes of various sizes to accommodate this. When inside this costume, Chris explored making her body larger or smaller, extending and shrinking the costume in various ways. At times, the animalism of the costume came to life. A bird character emerged through a chance encounter Chris made with her head and one of the small openings. As Chris could not see herself inside the costume, she had to feel her way. Multiple expressions emerged in relationship with movement, the cloth, and the body. Adding the small holes to the costume allowed different types of bodily expressions. Ambiguity in the form increased as Chris partially extended her limbs through the holes. It became apparent that this costume enabled the body to morph and to become other than itself. With Morphic 3, I intended to create a more expansive costume that could extend beyond the immediate space of the body and be landscape-like. I used 20 meters or so of a synthetic, semi-transparent and light reflective black fabric. The fabric has a very particular quality. It is incredibly light and slippery. Working with this fabric at the machine, it became evident that it has a life of its own. This was something to negotiate when making, especially as the costume became larger. The costume started to slip and slide over my machine, constantly moving around, shifting its weight and falling to the floor. Responding to this experience, at one point, I put the fabric construction on a mannequin and moved the mannequin close to the machine so it could support the weight as I stitched. At other times, I put the fabric construction on my own body, putting it over my head and sitting at the machine. I managed the weight using my body to feel when it was sliding and stitch in response to this movement. The costume has a large opening at its base and 2 smaller holes. Chris explored this costume in many different ways, as the materiality and scale of the work enabled multiple opportunities for interaction. Importantly, for the development of brightness, qualities of light could be explored. The fabric being semi-transparent and reflective provided new opportunities for choreography and dramaturgy. At times, Morphic 3 provides an interiority, cocooning the body as if waiting to be birthed inside a fluid cavity. Other times, backlighting enhanced the transparency of the fabric, emphasizing the cut work. Chris crouched within the costume, using her body to shape the internal volumes while her limbs explored moving inside. Other times, Chris allows the costume to engulf her with its movement. The material appears fluid and transforms its appearance as Chris rolls around in it. Additionally, Chris explored various ways of pulling other costumes and fabrics within it, as if the form was devouring others. I created the Morphic 4 costume during the residency, and the aim was to explore further how light reflection could be enhanced. I used a semi-transparent, reflective silver fabric. I intended to create a smaller costume than Morphic 3. The costume has a large opening at the bottom and a smaller one at the top. The small opening can enable the head or other body parts to extend to the outside. During the construction, I shaped the interior volume by adding 2 sizable cavities so that arms or legs could extend the form itself. Chris again interacted with this costume in many different ways. In some explorations, lighting was used to enhance the reflective qualities of the material. The combination of Chris's body, the costume, and the lighting gave the appearance of a moving solid. Chris folded her body inside, and the costume looked like a large rock or mineral, morphing and changing with her movements. Other times, she experimented with putting the costume inside of Morphic 3. She covered her head completely with the silver costume while emerging from the other. This combination of costumes gave the impression of growth or emergence. Morphic 5 was the last costume made during the residency. With this costume, I aimed to make a large version of the earlier coloured ones. This costume only has an opening at its base, and the interior volume is large enough to fit 2 people. The costume is voluminous and heavier than Morphic 3, without the properties of transparency. It integrates stripe and colour blocked work, as well as patterned sections. The internal volume is quite diverse in its shaping, with many cavities to explore through interaction with the body. I intended to add additional holes, however, the first experiments with Chris would be done without these due to our time constraints. Chris explored moving in this costume mainly through standing in it. Like all of the other costumes, it can be worn in different ways through 360-degree rotation. The coloration of this piece creates many different expressions as the body is interacting with it, extending and collapsing as Chris moves. So alongside the costume experimentation during the residency, conceptual imagery was produced which aimed to situate the costume development within the overall aims of the performance and its developing design for dramaturgy and staging. These collages were developed collaboratively by visual artist Claire Britton together with Chris and myself. The collages assist to highlight different aspects of the costuming, which were reflected upon and enhanced through image making. This includes the capacity for the costumes to hide or reveal the body, to reveal body parts, and for doubling and multiplication. We also acknowledge that the variations in the costumes produced is likely to enable multiple works. Not all are evidently part of the same work. For brightness, the key costume experiments that provided the most traction were the ones that were semi-transparent and light reflective. Further work is yet to be undertaken by Chris with choreographic development and dancers, together with other aspects of the production design. I'll be working further with Chris in 2021 to develop or adapt the actual costumes for the production. In terms of my research questions, it is evident that there are a range of variables yet to explore further with dynamic cutting and the moving body. These experiments demonstrate the transformative potential of the method when combined with the moving body and choreography. This is an exciting development of my practice, which enables me to expand my experience from a fashion design context to a performative dance context. I am still working on situating my research as I explore the performance field further and welcome comments and suggestions. Thank you very much.